NCHS makes independence the goal for people living with chronic bleeding disorders, which is why they do so much more than just fill prescriptions. And we wanted you to meet some of the people providing top-of-the-line services through NCHS. Meet Sue.
I'm the new pharmacist at NCHS, and my role is to help everybody, and I'm here for everyone, anytime, all the time, anything you need.
And that is what makes NCHS so special. Care providers who do exactly that. Care.
We really care about the patient. Whatever the patient needs, we're here for you. We're here all the time, 24/7, and we have a great team. It's a small team, but we have an awesome, amazing people to work with. Everybody is a team player and will do anything to help our patients.
Learn more about NCHS's services and the team who provides them by visiting nchswecare.com. Once again, that's nchswecare.com.
Hello and welcome to the Powering Through podcast, featuring panel conversations on obstacles, challenges, and what it takes to overcome, held for the benefit of the bleeding disorders community. The Powering Through podcast is sponsored by NCHS, produced by Bloodstream Media, and I am your host, Heather Robb. You can subscribe to the Powering Through podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to have the most recent episode delivered directly to you. And visit poweringthrough.org to see videos, photos, and other podcast episodes from all of our Powering Through events. In this episode, we give a listen to our Powering Through event held at National Hemophilia Foundation's Colorado chapter as part of their annual Education Day. Our participants were Seth Rajani, Cathy Bombardier, and Lacey Jay Henderson, and the host of the Powering Through panel is James Lynch. We start our conversation with Seth. Seth was 6 months old when he was diagnosed with both hemophilia A and neuroblastoma, a type of cancer. At 11 months, doctors accidentally severed his spinal cord during tumor removal surgery, leaving him a T2 paraplegic. But Seth hasn't let any of that stop him, thanks to the influence of his parents and community. So let's take a listen to the NHF Colorado's Powering Through panel, starting with Seth Rajani.
So Seth, you have severe hemophilia A.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
You obviously also are managing some other challenges, health-related challenges in your life. Can you tell us a little bit about the neuroblastoma diagnosis that you received as a kid and how that unfolded?
Yep. So when I was 6 months old, I was diagnosed with severe hemophilia A, as you mentioned, and then neuroblastoma on the same day. So it's a cancer, and they went to remove the tumor. Successfully did so when I was 6 months old. Told us that the cancer was never going to come back. At 11 months old, the cancer did come back again, and they did the same tumor or removal again, but this time they accidentally cut my spinal cord, leaving me a T2 paraplegic from then on out.
And when I asked you about your early memories, you were quite young, right? The second surgery was around 11 months?
Old, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So what are your first memories as a kid of recognizing that maybe health-wise you were managing a couple different things different than your peers?
I think I always knew, I could just tell visually that I wasn't exactly the same as all my other friends in school and all that, but it didn't really faze me, I guess. I kind of liked being different. To this day, I still like being different, so it didn't really bother me too much, but in terms of, I guess I really started to notice it when I was trying to play sports and wasn't necessarily able to do the same things as some of my friends or be on the same teams as some of my friends, and that was a little bit frustrating. And
social tensions of not being able to participate with your peer group in certain ways?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned liking being different. What is it about being different that appeals to you?
I always knew that I was different, so it wasn't anything I had to think about, really. It was just, okay, I have this, I am who I am, let's go from there.
I'm also curious, because you are a type 2 paraplegic and use a wheelchair, there's also like you said, there's a visual identifier of like, oh, something's going on different with this guy than with most people. Mm-hmm. But most of us with hemophilia, if we're not managing another challenge that has a visible component to it, shall we say, especially kids, it's an invisible disorder, an invisible disease, same with VWD. So in school, with friends, it can be challenging to feel like you're being actually seen, or when you say, I can't participate in gym today because I have a knee bleed, but they can't really see anything. Mm-hmm. Do you feel as though in some ways the fact that you do use a chair and you're pursuing athletics in an advanced way, has that helped people account for your specific needs in a way that maybe if it was more invisible would be more challenging for you?
I think that has a little bit to do with it. They obviously could then see. It wasn't me explaining like you said, I have a bleed and I can't do this. So it was a combination of both though as well, because if I had a bleed in my upper body, they'd be like, well, what is that? And then sometimes they'd be like, oh, maybe you're in a wheelchair because you have these bleeds or because you have hemophilia, where that's not the case for me. It's been something different.
Starting to play sports and noticing, okay, my friends are having opportunities that I'm not having. How did you and your family respond when that started to occur?
We were always told no, so that was a little bit difficult, but luckily I have two parents that taught me to say, like, no, that no is not an acceptable answer, and to keep working and keep going for what you want and striving for what you want and getting what you want. So my parents really pushed hard for what I needed, and playing sports was what I needed, and they wouldn't take no for an answer, so they were able to keep pushing the right buttons and talking to the right people to get where I wanted and to get where I needed. I really wanted to play basketball. Basketball is my favorite sport, and there wasn't really a program for kids to play wheelchair basketball yet. So there was camps over the summer that I would go to, and finally both my parents, and I think more my mom too, she really pushed hard to get a wheelchair basketball program going for kids. And right when I was about 11, 12 years old, a team finally started to form, and we were able to get that team going. And I was one of the first to participate on that wheelchair basketball team, which life has kind of come full circle, and now I'm coaching that team. We were going to nationals in Louisville, Kentucky for our national tournament. Our men's team is ranked 7th in the nation this year, and then our juniors team is ranked 19th, but we were the national champions last year, so looking to repeat this year.
Nice, all right. Yeah. So I'm curious about the kind of the medical component of actually playing sports. As someone with severe hemophilia, and you can kind of help guide where your other health challenges come into play, but in order for you to play at these higher levels, you had to work out a deal with the clinicians at the HTC here in Denver. Can you take us through that process and how that went?
Yeah, the only way I was going to be able to play sports, specifically basketball and sled hockey, was to make the deal with my HTC and physicians that I couldn't play unless I was really diligent and on schedule with my prophylactic treatment. I could not miss a dose. And then days that I knew I was going to be more active, whether it be with practice, tournaments, games, whatever it may be, I needed to take an extra dose to really try to be as healthy as possible and keep my joints as healthy as possible. So that was really the only way I was going to play sports, and I knew that, everybody else knew that, so that was real important.
And was that something prior to you playing at higher levels and making that deal? Had you been on prophylaxis before that? Yep. Had you been adherent to it, or were you struggling with it, or what was the kind of before that deal regimen for you?
I probably struggled with it beforehand. My mom can say more about that, and she would probably say, yeah, I struggled with it a bit more, but I knew that if I wanted to play sports and if I wanted to be the athlete I had in my mind that I wanted to be, then yeah, I needed to do it.
There are areas where there's a lot of hesitation around being physical with bleeding disorders. And that's reasonable to an extent, right? It's obvious to an extent. But something that really stuck out for me with Chris's story and is paralleled by your story, Seth, is that sometimes it is the pursuit of being physical that enables and empowers the individual to adhere to a regimen that improves their life. It can be the key for that young person who wants to be physical to actually adhere to a prophylactic regimen, or to overcome a needle phobia, or to overcome infusion exhaustion. I think that's an important piece to a conversation about should I let my son or daughter do X, Y, Z? Well, will it help them adhere and improve their self-care? That's an ingredient of that conversation, and your story, I think, is an example of why it must be a part of that conversation. Was there anything with your HTC that was kind of specific to your circumstance in your regimen that might be different from someone else who has severe hemophilia A that wanted to play basketball at these higher levels?
Well, for me, it's just maintaining my upper body joints, specifically like my shoulders, elbows, wrists. Those are obviously my target joints because I use those most often. So it's really just maintaining the health of those joints. I wouldn't say it was anything extremely different than anybody else who wants to play basketball. I'm sure the deal would probably be pretty much the same in terms of infusing when you're going to be more active and being on time with your prophylactic schedule and all that type of stuff. So I don't think it was too drastically different, just other than focusing on my target joints, which happened to be my upper body.
Using your arms so much every day for mobility, I just am kind of surprised you don't have more bleeding episodes than it sounds like you do.
I would say I'm pretty lucky that I haven't had more. I'm sure I've had a couple bad ones where I haven't been able to push by myself, and I've needed someone to push me for a couple days to make sure I rest until it is fully healed. So that has happened. But I've been really lucky, I think, in terms of not having too many major bleeds and haven't had too much joint damage so far, considering how active I've been.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about the fusion surgery that you had?
I had a total spine fusion surgery back in 2011. 11. So they fused from pretty much my pelvis all the way up to my neck because I had a curvature in my spine. And that was a big ordeal, 8-hour surgery, tons of blood loss. I was living in Florida at the time, so I had to work with doctors from all over the country, from Florida, Dr. Marilyn Mako Johnson here, and then also my surgery was performed in Sacramento, so I had to involve the HTC over in Sacramento. And it was a big deal. It was a long recovery. I had to pretty much relearn everything from having to get dressed because I pretty much had a whole new body, at least upper body at least. So it was a long recovery process, but it hopefully made me stronger. And
you have such a positive outlook and a forward-looking energy about you in general, but especially a year-long battle over something like that. I imagine there were times where that was really tested.
It was frustrating, yeah.
And how did you cope with that?
Well, my dad always told me, and both my parents instilled in me a very early age to always think positive and good things will happen. So just trying to have that positive attitude and knowing that I can get through this and I will get through this. Also just having that perspective, being in 3 different, buckets of world of hemophilia, physical disability, and cancer world, I've kind of seen that there's always somebody out there that's worse. For me, I really enjoyed being on a team. I think being in a team atmosphere is pretty important. You have that camaraderie, you have that support instantly with the team. So I thought that was a great experience for me from growing up, from being on a team since an early age. And it taught me to be a leader and how to be a leader and how to interact with others. And I thought just being in that team aspect was really important from a real early age, and I would strongly recommend it to everybody out there because I think it's an important experience for everybody to be a part of and learn. That
was such a big part of my interest in sports as a kid too, and I had an inhibitor, and so there were a lot of years where I couldn't be that physically active. Mm-hmm. It was actually when I kind of accidentally wound up in a musical. Oh, it's a team. We're all working together, like we have this script and we have this production, and at 8 o'clock, a whole slew of things have to happen that 38 of us are involved in order to complete this experience. I loved that. And for me, it was able to kind of help me move away from sports where I just wasn't fine. It wasn't for me. It wasn't working out. But put that energy and that interest into another team activity that gave me a sense of, okay, I belong to something. I'm a part of something bigger. This is fun. This is exciting. And I was just wondering if you could share just a little bit of what you've learned about that role as a coach and as a leader of these young people on the junior Rolling Nuggets. How to connect with people, but also knowing that everybody is different. They're not all the same. So on our kids team, we have various disabilities from CP to paraplegic to anything you can imagine. That we've got arthrogryposis, whatever. So being able to manage that and really adapting to the kids' strengths and putting them in a position to be successful, whether that be on the court, off the court, making sure that they're successful in every way they can be, and learning from them as much as I'm trying to teach them, and they're learning from me. Right on. Well, good luck next week, both as a coach and as a competitor. Thanks. Seth Rajani, everybody.
Next up, we hear from hemo mom Cathy Bombardier. Her son Chris has recently become well known in the bleeding disorders community for being the first person with severe hemophilia to complete the 7 summits, climbing the tallest peak on each of the 7 continents. Cathy talks about the challenges of raising an exceptionally active child with severe hemophilia. Let's jump back in and hear from Cathy.
I want to talk a little about family history. So, obviously you have the perspective of the mother of a son with hemophilia and a son who really wanted to push his limits with hemophilia. So let's go back to before you had the son, you had your family's history with hemophilia. Can you share a little bit about that?
Well, I knew growing up I had 2 uncles with hemophilia. I didn't know one of them at all. He had passed away before I was even born. And the other one I really didn't know well. He was living in Florida. The only thing I knew about hemophilia was what I learned in science class. And
Which is probably minimal.
Yeah, very minimal. And there was, of course, no social media, no anything. And so even the few times that I had met my uncle, surviving uncle at that time, never even knew why his legs were in ACE wraps, why he walked with a cane. Just never knew any of that. Never, and it was something my mom never talked about. It just never really came up. I just knew that if I was going to have kids and I had boys, I was supposed to tell the OBGYN, because there was not testing back then, genetic testing, that I was supposed to say, well, you're supposed to test the kids when they're born, and that's what we did. Andy did not have, my oldest son does not have hemophilia, And then Chris did.
Right. And Chris was born in 1985, so that's just coming on the heels of the blood contamination crisis. And I think you had mentioned to me recently rediscovering a journal entry or a log entry that acknowledged there was conversation at the HTC about, do we treat with factor or do we treat with plasma?
Well, and it was actually at University Hospital, at the old University Hospital.
Okay.
Chris had his first bleed when he was 3 months old from an MMR vaccination. And it actually took me 10 days to figure out that there was something wrong. I did not know. Areas swell, they get warm, kids cry, but it took me 10 days to figure out something wasn't right. And so we went down to university, to the HTC, and in the process, there was discussions about hepatitis C and things like that they had to, or B, that they had to test for. And do we give him factor? Do we give him plasma? And at 3 months old, he was going to have to be on an IV for several hours, I think it was, to do the plasma. And can you keep a 3-year-old hooked up to an IV for several hours? And their answer was no, and we're going to go ahead and use the factor, and that's what they decided. And then they tested him for years and years and years afterwards for hepatitis.
That must have been a very frightening time to have your first child with hemophilia.
It was, and then the only thing that you're seeing about hemophilia and hearing at the time in the community was Ryan White and the Ray family and all that. That was all in the news, right around that time that Chris was born. And so that was very scary.
And so what were the steps that started to take that scary, to start to alleviate that and start to introduce you to the realities of the community and not just the kind of scary headlines in history?
Chris really was never the normal kid with a hemophilia thing. So after that first bleed, he didn't bleed again until he was like 4 or 5. Went through all those toddler years without a bleed. They even retested him on our request, because it's like, this isn't what the picture was that they painted.
Right.
Learn to walk, do all these other things, and no bleeds. By that time, they started getting better factor products and stuff, but there was really no talk back then about the prophylaxis and all that, especially because he didn't bleed very often. It was more the treat afterwards type of thing. Mm-hmm. And they might have talked to us about it, but they didn't really push it at that point.
I know another thing that we talked about for the documentary was how important, obviously, insurance is when you're someone who's managing any chronic health challenge. How much did still this new consideration weigh heavy on the family from an insurance standpoint?
Oh, very much so, because there were huge layoffs. And it's like, well, what are we going to do? Because back then, it's like, if you had a pre-existing condition, there wouldn't be insurance, and you have to work for a bigger company. There was always that if he would lose his job, where would we go? What would we do?
So then when Chris, kind of like Seth, got a little bit older, started wanting to be more physically active, he too had to start kind of reconciling some self-care practices and working with Sue Garrity and the team at the HTC to get comfortable with infusion.
Most of you probably know Chris has and it's still to this day, horrible needle phobia. So Sue taught me how to infuse Chris, and I don't remember at what age that was. I don't think we ended up doing many home infusions. We tried. Some were very successful. A lot of times it was packing up all of our stuff, going to the treatment center, or going to Children's after hours, because we'd already spent too much time trying that negotiation piece of infusing.
And were you a nurse at this point as
No.
well? No, not yet. Okay.
No.
Okay.
So when he got to wanting to continue playing baseball in high school, we knew something was going to have to change. There was going to be a lot more stresses on joints and everything, muscles. Most of Chris's bleeds were all muscle bleeds when he grew up, not, thankfully, joints. But it's like, no, we're going to really have to start prophylactically treating. You can't play. And so after many, many fights between the two of us, and tears and yelling and everything, it was like, I'm done. I told him, I'm done. You either have to own up to this, take on this responsibility, or give up baseball. I said, you don't have to play. It's your choice. And he chose baseball, which meant he went and he worked with Sue, and a long time, on learning to self-infuse. There were a lot of times he didn't want to do it, but he knew he had to, and that was his passion, was baseball. And he hated those infusions. He hated them.
Yeah, I think he still does.
Yeah, he does.
What do you say to parents when they say, how could you let your son do that? Or should I let my son do X, Y, Z? How do you negotiate those conversations?
Well, and I think it's individualized. I mean, that was Chris's passion, was the baseball. That's what drove him. That's actually what got him through school. He knew he had to keep his grades up to play baseball. You know, there's always the danger the mountains present themselves with. Everest, obviously, earthquakes and things like that. When Chris started all this rock climbing and stuff with his Uncle Dave and whatever, it was like, oh my God, what are you even thinking about? And so my husband Alan and I went on a little rock climbing day with them. And we watched, you know, the safety and the precautions and everything he was learning along the way to make it safe, to give us a little bit of relaxation in the fact that he was learning how to do things the right way.
Another important piece of, I think, Chris's development, my development, a young person's development, is meeting a partner. What was it like for you when Chris said, I'd like you to meet Jessica Carter?
Absolutely awesome. And she took such interest. I mean, I don't know exactly the storyline as I probably in the beginning is probably when Chris shared with her, but she took such interest in it, you know, and wanted to learn how to infuse, and she did all those things, and it was just awesome. Couldn't have asked for a better person.
Chris is going to Doane to play baseball, and we chatted about this previously, and we're just kind of talking about it a little in the hall, how it made sense for him to go to a smaller school for baseball reasons, and he'd get more playing time and all of that. But in retrospect, there were some other benefits to it being a small school.
Absolutely. So, yeah, we started checking out colleges when Chris was a senior in high school. So we found that there are all these little small schools throughout the Midwest. And Doane College, which is in Crete, Nebraska, just south of Lincoln, was the school that we chose for Chris to go to. And he ended up playing baseball there 4 years, which was awesome, and was one of the captains on his team. But I think the biggest reward came from the care. We met with Nurse Kelly. She took ownership of Chris's hemophilia. We had information from the HTC. We took it out to school when Chris was starting. Nurse Kelly had set up a meeting at the school when Chris was starting. The team trainers became the eyes. They would call Sue and Sharon and say, this is what's going on. What do you suggest? How much factor over how long a period of time? Nurse Kelly would infuse Chris if necessary. She'd pull him out of class if necessary, knowing that he had had a bleed the day before, and say, you're supposed to be resting and icing, get out of class. So it was the perfect environment for him. I don't think he would have gotten that attention at a big school.
It's a good thing to think about, that if you're managing hemophilia, von Willebrand disease, or any kind of chronic health challenge, if you go to a smaller school and are proactive about introducing yourself to the school,
Yes.
you can set yourself up for that kind of environment. Bigger school, less likely to be the case.
Lastly, we hear from Lacey Jay Henderson. Lacey is a Paralympian whose leg was amputated at 9 years old after she was diagnosed with synovial sarcoma. She talks about the many challenges she's faced beyond her disability, from bullies to mental health challenges. We'll jump back in to hear from Lacey right after this quick word from our sponsor.
At NCHS, they provide door-to-door delivery of your prescription medications, but they also do so much more, like have pharmacists available 24/7 for your support, overnight delivery in emergency situations, prescription refill reminders, notification of delivery status, education and support programs, and detailed explanations for all medications, including storage requirements, side effects, precautions, dosing parameters, and instructions for use. NCHS is not just about delivering you medication, they're about letting you know that they care for life. To learn more, visit nchswecare.com. Again, that's nchswecare.com.
She is a Paralympian. She is a record holder in pole vault and long jump, and competed in Rio in the 2016 Paralympics. She is a 5-time national champion, and she's also, as of May 13th of 2016, my cousin, Lacey Jay Henderson. Like, what does a Paralympian professional athlete do for a day-to-day life?
I was training in Phoenix full-time the past 3 years, warm weather training, track and field. Went to Rio, and I just had some opportunities. Both my coaches relocated just north of Austin. I also contract for a medical device manufacturer for prosthetics, and our U.S. headquarters is in Austin, so, the stars align. Have a little breakfast, try to do some life management type thing. Go to the track, hit the track for a couple hours, eat, go to the gym, hit the gym for a couple hours, and then recover and, rinse and repeat. I'm fortunate enough to be at a level now where I get funding from USA as well as insurance benefits, which is very important for people like us. Again, being an athlete, not only at the professional level, but also an athlete with like an interesting circumstance, having to wear prosthetics and also getting different devices for different events. It is not cheap.
Sure.
It is not cheap to have a disability, especially in this country. I think at the end of the day, no matter what your choice of passion is, like when you have passion, when you're in love with something, like you put the pieces together and you make it work. You constantly live your life always adapting to your environment because the world was not created for people with, unique circumstances like ours.
Right.
So when you learn to apply that in different formats in life, like you become more resilient in ways and you find ways to make things work. I was 9 years old when I was diagnosed with a soft tissue cancer called synovial sarcoma. I was misdiagnosed for a long time. Because I come from an athletic background, they're like, maybe it's growing pains, you're probably sore from sports, blah, blah, blah. I had a pain in my knee, it just wasn't getting better. So after a bunch of misdiagnoses, finally took an MRI and saw a lipo-shaped tumor inside of my knee, did a biopsy. It was not great news. So I was actually, at the time, it was the rarest case of that cancer. So I was put on experimental trials. I had less than 1% tumor kill, nothing was working. And the treatment sometimes I feel like is worse than the disease. And so I ended up getting a bunch of tissue damage, a bunch of organ failure. And it was getting to the point where it was going to be permanent if we didn't make a decision. And again,
the decision to make
was
amputation. Amputation.
Yeah, and I was diagnosed in 1999. At that time, we weren't around disability. We didn't know anything about any sort of medical community like that. We knew sports, that was it. And you're like, well, what does an amputee do? How do you navigate around life with a disability? So it was always not an option for us until it became the only option. And I got my leg amputated a month before I turned 10, and I've been in remission ever since.
There was a moment where you as the 9-year-old had to say yes to this. It wasn't just the doctors and parents, but you as a 9-year-old had to make a decision, I'm not gonna have one of my legs for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
Do you remember the moment where you had to say those words out loud?
Yeah. I was lucky. I had an incredible support system with my doctors. They were great. They were really transparent with me and my family. My parents and my doctors were always really transparent with me, even at the age of 9. If anything catastrophic health-wise were to happen, that was probably the best age for it to happen because I was able to conceptualize the gravity of illness and that it was serious. And we talked about death and we talked a lot about, your immune system, what happens when your blood count is down, what happens, if you get a scratch, because at the time, I was briefly hemophilia, just brief. I made a brief entrance and then a quick exit. My parents were great. Everybody was great with transparency and I think at the same time, you're able to understand that it's serious, but you don't have the weird emotional baggage that adults accumulate over the years.
Yeah.
So it became very simple at that age. It was well, you're sick and then you'll get better. And well, you're sick and you make this choice and then you get better. Yeah, it was an emotional meeting that we had with our doctors when we talked about that. And my parents are the ones that ultimately let me make the decision.
Did you face any kind of challenges as it related to being an amputee in school?
I came back to 5th grade. My teachers were great at my elementary school. I got homeschooled over the summer, so I didn't have to repeat a grade, which was great. And then middle school happened, and I don't think middle school is a walk in the park for anybody. I dealt with bullying, basically, and it started with the amputation. It started with being different. It started with somebody wearing a prosthetic. Because again, I'm sure your community is similar. When you have a child that's going through something, typically you're the only person in your geographical community that's dealing with this condition. And I think the fact that I didn't react to a lot of the ridicule and the fact that I wasn't ashamed and the fact that I didn't want to hide it, it kind of triggered a lot of stuff. Just dealt with some bullying. I ended up having to change schools in middle school. So when I was in the 7th grade, we had to start, our social studies teacher made us start something called a live teen journal. So some of the journals, things kind of started getting out of hand, and it was girls writing stuff about me, and then it started turning into threats. And I hid everything from my parents because, again, when you had mentioned with Seth, at that point, I was the only person with a prosthetic in my community. and I was fine with it, but at the same time, like, I just wanted to be normal. I just wanted to be like the same people as my friends. I just wanted to hang out and not be somebody different. But yeah, I was getting a lot of threats, like if I were to go to school, that like, you know, there would be like assaults, kind of stuff like that. So
High school, things stabilized.
Yeah.
College, you were a Division I cheerleader.
Yes.
So you were able to find, you know, your athletics kind of pulled throughout. Was there an existing path for you, or did you have to get creative?
my parents come from a little older generation. We have a different age gap. And so they knew that whatever I needed to do, I would just figure it out. They're
Yeah.
like, whatever, like, you're good, just figure it out. And I told my parents I wanted to become a cheerleader. I wanted to go to gymnastics class. And they were like, all right, like, just let us know where to drop you off at this point. I guess they were like passive advocates, you know, in the beginning of my sport career, just because, again, like, we always had to have something to do after school. My dad was coaching at the time, and so my brother and I constantly needed to find something to do after school since my dad would be busy and my mom was busy. And so I fell in love with the sport of cheerleading. And no, like, I hadn't found anybody that wore a prosthetic that was a cancer survivor. Again, this is like the dinosaur age of the internet, so
Sure.
it's not what it is now.
And particularly for people with rare chronic diseases, where you can be isolated and separated from people going through, like you said, your geographic region, sometimes you're the only one.
Yeah.
The social media has enabled us to communicate with one another
Yeah.
in profound ways as well. And that's when there's these talks about delete your Facebook account and, you know, don't do this anymore. I just think about all the people from this community who I've met around the world, and that's the only way I interact with them.
And like, it's a new form of empowering each other and empowering yourself to know that you are like an instant away from somebody who has had similar experiences as you, who can be like that crutch that you need just to get through somebody teasing you at school, because it
Yes.
happens.
Yeah, and sometimes all you need is someone who understands.
Who's just been there.
Don't need advice, don't need recommendation, I just need someone who
need to hear
understands
you.
to hear it.
My Olympics experience, I think, was unique in the fact that I have a great sports psychologist. Honestly, I have to give a lot of credit to him, as well as my coaches. Everybody's always super supportive. My support system, again, like, it goes from medical to really any sort of thing that you end up doing. And my sports psychologist really helped me, I think, when I was entering into Rio, to be present and to be grateful for the experience, which really aided in my performance, instead of solely focusing on the performance, really to just enjoy the process and trust my training and trust where the accumulation has brought me.
The team behind you.
Yeah.
You know, we talk about making the deals with the HTC, and we talk about reaching out to community who understands that thing you need them to understand. Just not allowing any circumstance to allow you to forget you have resources, you have
Yeah.
support, you know, that however alone you may feel, there are necessary resources. You cannot do certain things in life without support.
Yeah, children are very good at understanding that, and they're good at asking for help. But as we get older, as adults, we lose sight of it. And I think society as a whole has told us a dirty lie that when you face hardships, that you're only strong if you take care of it by yourself.
Right. Tough it out, get over it, push through it. Yeah.
And that's cheap fuel, you know. That's not necessarily the truth. And you know, we're better and we're stronger in numbers. And I was lucky to have a good support system and being able to reflect on that.
So for you, when it comes to mental health, how do you keep yourself balanced and in check?
I catch myself getting really anxious. Again, now, like I need to get a new prosthesis, and now I have to work with time management for how am I going to train, how am I going to go to the gym. Now, great, I get to go see a doctor, get a referral, get casted for a leg. Everything's a process. So when I can catch myself now a little bit better. Not every day's great, but when you start feeling like that anxious, that spiraling thing, I know maybe I need to take a step back, kind of gain an objective perspective and see what is manageable, like in the present moment. And again, that's the same thing with training. You look at sports the same way you look at every day in your training schedule, like, let's just handle the task at hand. And eventually the things get done that need to get done.
Mm-hmm. And Cathy, for you, I know when Chris started with the 7 summits, there were elevated levels of mental health challenges. Could you talk a little about that and what you did?
Yeah, so it was one thing when he did, when he climbed Kilimanjaro with his Uncle Dave, thank you, Dave, for getting all this started. And then when it got into the other mountains and he wasn't going to be able to climb with Dave, Chris had, you know, the support of the team and the treatment center and mountain professionals and all this. And like I said, I kind of lost it at a point. I actually did seek out a psychologist because I was almost having a nervous breakdown. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. It was just really hard. Lots and lots of tears. I didn't do a lot of research into Everest just because that one freaked me out a lot more than any other ones. I didn't want to know a lot about the mountain and the ice falls. Didn't really want to know all that till that was over. Knowing that Chris had the resources to know that he was not going to go into these things blindly. He was training very hard. He had a personal trainer. You know, to know that he was doing all the right things, talking to the treatment center, how do I up my factor? How do I do this? How do I do? So at least that part of it I knew was on him, and I knew he was actually being very responsible about it.
Seth, we talked earlier about your coping mechanisms and dealing with your peaks and troughs in mental health, but from the perspective of a coach, do you have opportunities where you see outside stressors from their life that are coming through in practices or coming through in games?
I actually have two kids, their brother and sister, that are on the team that are extremely hard on themselves. They feel pressure from their parents of making the team or trying out for the Paralympic team, and they're pretty young kids. So their parents put a lot of pressure on them. They put a lot of pressure on themselves. Those are the best two examples I can give you, but they are extremely hard on themselves, and if they make one bad play during a game or something, or even during practice, they are completely out of it for the whole rest of practice. So as my job as a coach is I have to pull them aside and maybe give them a little talking to and calm them down a little bit to make sure they can fully understand that, hey, we all make mistakes. It's going to happen. You can't worry that much about it. You got to work through it, on to the next play, on to the next thing. Be thinking positive, be how you can make up for that mistake. How can you help your teammates win this game or go on to the next thing?
Thank you again to Seth, Cathy, and Lacey for participating in Powering Through, and thanks as well to the board and leadership at NHF's Colorado chapter for hosting our panel. I'll be right back with smart people saying smart things after this final word from our sponsor.
NCHS believes in being a proactive partner in their patients' care, which means providing services like arranging convenient and discreet delivery, encouraging adherence to therapies, and monitoring your therapy outcomes. They also provide reimbursement services to help with navigating insurance requirements, which can be overwhelming for families affected by bleeding disorders or chronic disease. With a pharmacist available 24/7, NCHS can offer comfort to patients that someone will always be there when needed. Check out their website to learn more, nchswecare.com, or call 877-626-6247. Again, that's 877-626-6247.
Today's smart person is Oprah Winfrey. Oprah was raised by a poverty-stricken single mother in rural Mississippi. She moved to inner-city Milwaukee, where she endured abuse and hardship and became pregnant at 14. Her son died as an infant. She was sent to live in Tennessee, where she started working in radio. By 19, she was co-anchoring the local evening news, making her both the youngest and first Black female news anchor in the area. Within 10 years, she had the highest-rated talk show in Chicago, and the rest is history. Here's one of many smart things Oprah has said. There is no greater gift you can give or receive than to honor your calling. It's why you were born and how you become most truly alive. And that will do it for this episode of the Powering Through podcast. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back next month with another episode featuring another great conversation. Remember to subscribe to the Powering Through podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever it is you listen to podcasts. You can also stream our podcast episodes, watch videos of our conversations, and learn about upcoming Powering Through events by visiting poweringthrough.org. Many thanks to NCHS for sponsoring the Powering Through podcast. Learn more about NCHS and their services by visiting nchswecare.com, where you'll also find links to their Facebook and Twitter accounts. And you can learn more about all of Bloodstream Media's podcasts for the bleeding disorders community by visiting bloodstreammedia.com. This episode of the Powering Through podcast was written by Heather Robb and Patrick James Lynch, produced and distributed by Patrick James Lynch, Joshua Sterling Bragg, Rob Bradford, Colby Crow, and Avra Friedman. Artwork created by Ryan Geelan and Katie Wright-Mead, and the Powering Through podcast is edited by Allison Stoney. My name is Heather Robb, and until next time, take self-care of yourself.